Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The first time Mark heard the voice, he thought it was just the wind. He had been walking down the empty street on a late afternoon, a chill in the air that made him pull his jacket tighter around his chest. The street was nearly deserted, save for a few cars parked by the sidewalk and a distant dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood. Mark was lost in thought, trying to shake off the heaviness in his mind. Work had been exhausting lately, and his relationship with Sarah felt colder than usual. It wasn't that they had fought, at least not recently, but there was something between them, an unspoken distance. Then, just as he passed the corner of Maple Street, he heard it, a whisper, soft at first, barely audible. But it was there, right behind him. Mark. He stopped in his tracks, looking over his shoulder. There was no one there. The street was still empty. Only the faint hum of distant traffic broke the silence. Mark frowned and shook his head. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Mark? The whisper came again, clearer this time. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He turned around, eyes scanning the street, but still no one. He stood frozen for a moment, his breath misting in the cool air. He was starting to feel uneasy, but he couldn't explain why. It was just a sound, after all. It couldn't be anything more than his imagination. Trying to shake the feeling, he kept walking, his footsteps quickening. The whisper had stopped, but a strange sensation lingered, as though someone was following him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and for a second, he felt as though something was just out of reach, something watching, waiting. He tried to brush it off. It was nothing. The world wasn't so full of mysteries, not anymore. People didn't disappear like they used to. No one was going to come out of the shadows to drag him into some dark corner. But when he reached his apartment, the unease followed him. The door to his place opened with a creak, the familiar smell of stale coffee and half-finished work filling his senses. He dropped his keys on the table and walked into the living room. "Sarah," he called. No response. He frowned. Sarah was usually home by now. Her absence wasn't unusual, but tonight felt different. His skin tingled, as though he was waiting for something or someone. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, even though the apartment was empty. He stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the stillness of the space. Then he heard it again. "Mark?" It was faint, almost drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator. He froze. This time, the voice didn't feel like a trick of the wind. It felt like it was coming from inside the apartment, from somewhere near him, though no one else was there. He slowly turned around, searching the room, but everything looked normal. The same books on the coffee table, the same pictures hanging on the walls. "Mark?" The voice echoed from somewhere deep within him. It wasn't just a whisper this time. It was like the air itself was calling his name, and as the sound reverberated in his mind, he felt a sickening chill wash over him. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, his mind racing. He didn't know what was happening. Was it stress? Exhaustion? Or was he truly losing his mind? His phone buzzed in his hand, breaking the silence. "Mark, I'll be home soon," Sarah's text read. He stared at the words for a moment. The timing felt strange. He had heard the voice right before his phone went off. His heartbeat quickened, and he felt a growing sense of dread in his gut. It wasn't possible. The voice couldn't be coming from Sarah. It wasn't her. He had heard it. He had felt it, deep in his chest. He sat down on the couch, trying to breathe deeply, to make sense of it. It was just the stress, just the pressure. Maybe it was the dark thoughts swirling in his mind, the loneliness, the frustration with his work, the cracks in his relationship. He tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, but then the whisper came again. "Mark?" This time it was different. The voice didn't sound like it was coming from a distance. It was much closer, as though it was right next to him. It echoed in his ear. He jerked his head to the side, his heart pounding in his chest, but again there was no one there. Panic surged through him. He jumped to his feet and rushed to the hallway, checking each room, expecting to find someone, or at least something, that could explain what was happening. But the apartment was empty, completely empty. The bathroom door was open, the bedroom unmade, the kitchen silent. He ran back into the living room, looking for anything that could give him a clue. He glanced at the small table by the door where his coat was hanging, and that's when he saw it. A small, folded piece of paper. It was lying on top of his wallet, as though someone had placed it there. His hand shook as he picked it up. There was no writing on the outside, just his name, Mark, written in black ink. He unfolded the paper, expecting to find something, anything that might help him make sense of the situation. But the words were chilling, a reflection of something he had never spoken aloud, something he didn't even fully understand. It's too late to go back. You've already crossed the line. Mark stared at the words, his mind racing. How could anyone know that? How could someone know what he was thinking? He had kept all his fears, his frustrations locked inside. No one knew. No one except. The whisper came again, closer this time. It seemed to echo from the walls themselves, as though the room had become alive with sound. Too late to go back, Mark. Too late to go back. He stumbled back, his breath shallow. He couldn't think. The walls, the air, the very space around him felt wrong. The echoing voice didn't sound like Sarah, or like anyone he knew. It was as though his own thoughts had taken shape and were now speaking back at him. His phone buzzed again. "Where are you?" "I'm outside." The text from Sarah made him freeze. She was already here? But that didn't make sense. He had just heard her text him earlier. He hadn't even heard her car pull up. His gaze shot to the door. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice echoed again, as though taunting him. Mark couldn't breathe. His hand went cold as he reached for the door handle. The thought of opening it, of facing whatever was on the other side, felt unbearable. But he had to. He had to know what was happening. Mark's hand trembled as he gripped the door handle. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay inside, to lock the door and pretend none of this was happening. But curiosity and fear pushed him forward. He pulled the door open, half expecting to find Sarah standing there, her face creased with concern, asking him what was wrong. Instead, the space beyond the door was empty. No one. The hallway was quiet, just as it had been before. He stepped out cautiously, peering both ways, but there was no sign of her. No sound at all, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator still running inside the apartment. His heart began to pound in his chest again. He glanced at his phone, Sarah's last text still there. It didn't make sense. Had he been imagining things? But then no. The voice. It had come from inside the apartment. He had felt it deep in his bones, echoing from the very walls. He stepped further into the hallway, eyes darting between the shadows. His breath was short, and the silence was starting to feel suffocating. He had to get out of here. He had to find Sarah, figure out what was going on. As he took a step toward the stairs, something caught his eye. A shadow, too quick to be a person, but distinct enough to make him freeze in his tracks. He stared at the empty hallway, his pulse racing, waiting for something to move again. But nothing. Then the whisper came. "She's not here, Mark. She never was." The words didn't just echo in the air. They felt like they were coming from inside his head, wrapping around his thoughts like a cold, wet blanket. The voice twisted his mind, pulling him deeper into confusion. He spun around, his back to the wall, searching for the source. But there was no one. No one except him. You wanted to know. You wanted to know what's real. The voice whispered again, closer this time. He felt a cold breath on his neck, and a shiver ran down his spine. Was this happening? Was he losing his grip on reality? His legs felt weak, and the world around him began to blur at the edges, as if the very fabric of the apartment was shifting. His hands were clammy, his breath shallow. He grabbed the railing of the staircase for support, trying to steady himself, but the air seemed to grow thick, as though something was pressing down on him. "You've always known, Mark. You've always known the truth." The voice was undeniable now, not a whisper, but a deep, haunting echo that seemed to come from every direction. It wasn't just in the apartment anymore, it was inside him, in his thoughts, in the very air he breathed. He felt a wave of dizziness crash over him, and his knees buckled, forcing him to crouch on the floor. "It's too late to go back, Mark. Too late to fix what you've done." Mark's mind swirled with fragmented thoughts, guilt, fear, shame. It was as though the voice was pulling his deepest secrets to the surface, dredging up the things he'd buried inside for years. His darkest desires, his regrets, all of them laid bare. "You never loved her. You never loved anyone." The words cut through him like a knife, and Mark recoiled, his chest tightening. It wasn't true. He loved Sarah, he had to. But the voice, his voice, insisted otherwise. Every lie he had told himself about love, about his life, about his choices, all came rushing forward. Was it true? Had he never really loved anyone? You wanted to escape, to run away. But you can't. The voice taunted him, each word more suffocating than the last. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in around him, pushing him further into the spiral of his own thoughts. It felt like a nightmare, but Mark couldn't wake up. He was trapped in this apartment, trapped in his mind. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperate to block out the voice, but it only grew louder. "You can't escape your own mind, Mark. You can never escape." Tears welled in his eyes, and for a moment he forgot where he was. His head throbbed, his thoughts a storm of confusion. What had he done to deserve this? What had he done wrong? He couldn't breathe. He gasped for air, clutching his chest as if he could push the suffocating weight off him. The voice, it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was part of him, a shadow of his own thoughts. It was as if he was hearing himself from the outside, hearing the worst parts of himself, the parts he had hidden away for so long. "Sarah's gone. You knew she would leave. You knew she couldn't love you after all." Mark screamed, his voice loud in the empty hallway. "No, no, that's not true." He stood up, frantic, running toward the door, the need to escape burning in his chest. But before he could reach the exit, the voice changed. "Mark?" It was soft again, almost tender, but it wasn't Sarah. It was a voice that sounded familiar, but it wasn't his own. It echoed through the air like a lost memory. The door slammed shut behind him with a force he couldn't control, trapping him inside. He spun around, his eyes wide with panic. There was something in the apartment with him now, something more than just the voice. "I've been waiting for you, Mark." The room around him shifted again, like the world itself was bending, twisting into something else. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes locked on a figure standing by the window. It was a silhouette at first, just a shadow, but as Mark's vision cleared, he could make out the shape of a person, a tall figure, standing perfectly still, its face obscured by darkness. "You've always been afraid of me, Mark." The voice was familiar again, and yet it wasn't. It was like hearing his own voice, but deeper, more distorted. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Mark couldn't move. His legs were frozen, his body unwilling to react. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure by the window. "I am you, Mark. I am the part of you you've always tried to ignore." Mark's breath hitched. The figure stepped forward, its face still hidden in shadow. But the voice, it was undeniable. It was him. It was his own voice. "You can't escape yourself." Mark felt his stomach twist, his heart pounding in his ears. The figure took another step closer, its form becoming clearer with every passing moment. Mark tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was trapped in his own home, trapped with a version of himself that he couldn't escape. Mark's breath came in short, frantic gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure moved closer, its presence oppressive, suffocating. His mind was a swirl of confusion. Every part of him screamed for him to run. but his legs remained frozen, unable to move. The shadow loomed larger as it approached him, the soft echo of his voice repeating over and over in his head. "You can't run from me, Mark. You've never been able to run." The words hung in the air, twisting his insides. He knew those words, knew them as if they had always been a part of him, buried deep within the darkest corners of his mind. His pulse raced as the figure's shape became clearer, a tall, gaunt silhouette with features too distorted to fully make out. But he didn't need to see the face. He could feel it, feel the suffocating weight of whatever this thing was. "I am you," the figure said, its voice a guttural version of his own. "Everything you've hidden from yourself is now coming to the surface." Mark's hands were shaking as he tried to steady himself, as though doing so would somehow bring him back to reality. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. This couldn't be happening. But it was. Every word, every breath, every second felt like an unraveling of something he had always kept locked away. "You think you're the only one who feels it? The loneliness? The desire to escape?" The figure's voice was cold, mocking. "I know you, Mark. I am your darkness. I am what you keep buried, the part of you that you've always feared." "No," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling with disbelief. "No, you're not me. You're not real." But the figure only smiled, a slow, cruel smile that stretched across its face, revealing something darker beneath. Mark's stomach turned as a cold chill ran down his spine. "I'm very real," it replied, its voice lowering to a sinister murmur. "And you've always known it. Deep down, you've always known I was here." Mark's hands clenched into fists as the overwhelming pressure in the room intensified. His mind raced for a way out, but his voice wouldn't stop. It continued to echo, bouncing off the walls, reverberating inside his skull, feeding his fears, his insecurities, his darkest thoughts. "You can't escape me, Mark. You've never been able to escape yourself." The words dug into him like a knife, each one a reminder of his deepest regrets, the things he'd never said aloud. He had always tried to bury them, to forget. But now they were here, standing before him. The things he feared most, now embodied in this twisted version of himself. "Sarah," the figure's voice was soft now, almost tender. "She never loved you. Not really. You pushed her away, didn't you? You've always pushed people away. Always afraid they'd see the real you." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The voice had struck a nerve. He couldn't deny it. There were times when he had pulled away from Sarah, times when he had built walls between them, afraid to let her see the parts of him he thought were unlovable. He had always been afraid of being truly known, truly understood. But that was the past. That was before. "It's too late for you, Mark. Too late to fix what you've broken." The figure took another step toward him. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing in, as if they were alive and suffocating him. The air felt thick with the weight of his own thoughts, his own guilt. "You're nothing but a liar," the figure continued, its voice now low and venomous. "A coward who can't even face the truth about himself. You've always been a coward." Mark stumbled backward, his mind spinning, his body frozen. The air around him seemed to grow colder, thicker, until it felt as if he were drowning in his own fear. The voice, it wasn't just echoing in his ears now. It was inside him, twisting his every thought, making him question everything. "You're so afraid of what's inside you, Mark. But you can't escape it. You can't escape me." Mark's eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape, but there was nothing. The windows were shut tight, the door locked. His heart raced as the figure moved closer, its shape now almost clear, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. "No," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "No, I won't listen to you. You're not real." The figure stopped in front of him, its face still hidden in shadow, but its voice, a twisted reflection of his own, was unmistakable. "I am as real as you, Mark. You can't deny me any longer." Mark's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. His mind was reeling, his body shaking with a terror he couldn't explain. The voice was everywhere now, filling the room, the apartment, his mind. You are the echo of your own soul, Mark. The words seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could hear was that voice, his voice, echoing over and over, each repetition a painful reminder of everything he had buried, everything he had tried to forget. It's all coming back to you, Mark. Every thought, every fear, every regret. You can't run from it anymore. The figure's shadow loomed over him, growing larger with each passing second. Mark's mind was no longer his own. He could feel the weight of the figure's presence pressing in on him, like an inescapable truth. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a part of him, a part he had tried to ignore. But it had always been there, just beneath the surface. Your mind now, the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. I've always been yours. Mark's body tensed as the shadow reached down, its cold, unseen hand brushing against his cheek. His skin burned with the touch, and the whisper echoed louder in his mind, drowning out everything else. There's no way out, Mark. No way out but through me. Mark's vision blurred, and the walls around him seemed to shift once more. The voice, the figure, was everywhere. It was inside him, outside him, surrounding him in a suffocating fog. There was nowhere to run, no escape from the reflection of his own soul. You'll never be free. Mark's breath came in ragged sobs, his body trembling as the weight of the truth he had always feared, pressed down upon him. There was no escape, not from the figure, not from the voice, not from himself. Mark's chest heaved as he fought for air, his hands gripping the floor, as though trying to hold himself together. His mind, once full of logical thoughts, was now a swirling mass of confusion and panic. The shadow loomed over him, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to crush the very air from his lungs. You're still pretending, Mark. Pretending that you're not scared. Pretending that you're not broken. The voice was a sharp, insistent whisper, cutting through him like a razor. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. It was like an insidious presence inside his own head, pulling at his every thought, twisting them, warping them. You're a failure. You always have been. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The words stung, deeper than any physical wound. He wanted to scream, to push the voice away, but his throat felt tight, constricted. He was choking on his own fear. The echo of his thoughts seemed to invade every corner of his mind. You've always known the truth, Mark. Deep down, you've always known you weren't good enough. You've always known you'd lose everyone eventually. No! Mark shouted, his voice hoarse, desperate. His hands shook as he pushed himself up, barely able to stand. No, that's not true. But the figure simply watched him, silent, its shape dark and indistinct, as if it was no longer even trying to be human. It was something worse, something that didn't belong in the world, something that had come from the deepest recesses of his mind. Everything you love will slip away from you, Mark. It's what you deserve. The voice was cold, mocking. Sarah, your family, everyone you've ever cared about, they'll all leave, just like you've always pushed them away. Mark's hands clenched into fists, nails biting into his palms. The words were true. In some sick, twisted way, they felt true. He had always kept people at arm's length, always afraid that if they knew the real him, they'd run. So he kept them out, just like he had kept Sarah at a distance. He had told himself that he wanted a meaningful relationship, that he was capable of it, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had never been willing to open up, to truly be vulnerable with anyone. Not even her. You think you can change? You can't change who you are, Mark. The truth is, you're a coward, and cowards don't deserve anything real. The figure took a slow step forward, its form becoming clearer with each movement. Mark felt the cold sweat running down his back as the figure's shadow swallowed him whole. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't escape. He was locked in this endless loop of self-doubt, each echo of the voice a sharp reminder of his worst fears. He wanted to collapse. He wanted to cry. He wanted to scream for someone, anyone, to help him. But the only sound in the room was the echo of his own thoughts, growing louder, more deafening. It was as if the room itself was crumbling beneath the weight of his guilt, his shame, his self-loathing. Sarah's gone now. She saw the real you, didn't she? Saw through all the lies you told yourself. She couldn't stay with someone like you, Mark. Mark staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. The words were poison, dripping into his mind. He had told himself for so long that he could be a better person, that he could change. But now it felt like that dream was slipping away from him, just like everything else in his life. "No!" he screamed, this time louder, his voice raw with emotion. He stumbled toward the door, toward the exit, but the figure blocked his path, standing between him and freedom. "There's nowhere to run," the voice echoed, deep and mocking. "You're trapped with yourself, Mark. Trapped in the prison of your own mind." Mark's hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, but it was no use. The door wouldn't budge. His mind was spinning out of control, trapped in a cycle of despair that he couldn't escape. The air around him seemed to press in harder, suffocating him. It was like the room itself was closing in, its walls moving inward, pushing him toward the very thing he feared most. "You can't escape the truth, Mark. You never could, and you never will." The figure's voice was like a blade now, cutting through his thoughts, pulling out the darkest parts of his soul, the parts he had kept buried. The self-doubt, the anger, the resentment, it was all coming to the surface, and Mark felt like he was drowning in it. He took a step back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His chest felt tight, and for a moment he thought he might collapse right there. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. Mark's eyes searched the room desperately, looking for some way out. But there was nothing, only the figure, only the voice. "I am you," it whispered, and Mark's blood ran cold. "I am everything you fear. I am everything you've tried to hide." Mark's head spun. The room seemed to tilt, everything around him blurring. He staggered backward, his vision darkening. He felt as if he were falling, tumbling into an abyss where the voice was the only thing left, the only thing real. "You wanted to know, didn't you? You wanted to know the truth about yourself? Well, here it is, Mark." He collapsed onto the floor, his mind reeling, his body shuddering. The figure stood above him, its shadow swallowing him whole. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the echo of his own voice suffocating him. The words, his words, whispered through the darkness, each one a hammer against his fragile sanity. "You've always known the truth, Mark. And now, you can't deny it anymore." Mark's eyes fluttered shut, and the world around him faded into nothingness. There was only the voice, the echo, and the crushing, unbearable weight of the truth. Mark awoke to an unsettling silence. The weight that had pressed down on him, suffocating him with its oppressive presence, was gone. For a fleeting moment, he thought he had escaped. He thought the nightmare was over. But as he opened his eyes, the room didn't feel right. The shadows that clung to the corners were darker now, heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding something back. The familiar shapes of his apartment seemed distorted, as if viewed through a fogged glass. His chest tightened as he sat up, his hands still shaking. He looked around, expecting to see the figure, but the room appeared empty still. It wasn't right. Something was wrong. "You can't escape, Mark." The voice, his voice, cut through the silence like a blade, sending a wave of icy dread crashing over him. It was still here, still inside him, lurking in the background of his thoughts, waiting to be heard. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. "You think you've outrun me?" The voice whispered again, this time closer, as if standing just behind him. "You've only just begun to understand, Mark. You can't hide from what you are. Not anymore." Mark stood up, his legs unsteady, as if his body was still trapped in the aftermath of a dream. He turned around, scanning the room again, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, nothing but the silence pressing in on him. But the voice, his voice, still lingered, a persistent hum beneath his skin. I've been with you your whole life, Mark. All these years, I've been whispering to you, telling you the truth you've always ignored. He felt the sting of the words deep in his gut. The truth he had never wanted to face. The truth that had haunted him for as long as he could remember. The fact that he had always been afraid of himself, afraid of his own darkness, afraid of the person he was becoming. No, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as though to rid himself of the voice. No, I'm not like that. But the voice was relentless. It wouldn't stop. It continued, echoing through his thoughts, twisting them, turning them into something unrecognizable. You've always been this way, Mark. Always. You just didn't want to see it. The self-doubt, the fear, the anger, it's all inside you. It always has been. The walls seemed to close in around him, pressing in with an invisible weight, suffocating him. The more he tried to push the thoughts away, the louder the voice became. He stumbled toward the door again, his hand reaching for the handle. But when he turned it, it didn't move. It was locked. No, no, no. His mind spun, his heart racing. He slammed his fist against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The voice was everywhere now, inside his head, inside his very bones. Please, I just want it to stop. I want it to stop. You want it to stop, but you're the one keeping it alive, the voice said softly like a caress. You're the one who brought it to the surface. You wanted to know the truth, Mark, and now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You can't erase it from your mind. The air grew thick, almost sticky, as if the room itself had become a living thing, feeding off his fear. Mark's chest felt tight, his body trembling. He backed away from the door, stumbling toward the center of the room. He couldn't escape. The voice wouldn't let him escape. It was always there, waiting to be heard, waiting to pull him under. You've always been afraid of what you'd become, the voice continued, its tone shifting into something darker, more cruel. But you've always known the truth. You've known it since the beginning. You're nothing but a coward, Mark. And cowards don't deserve to be saved. Mark fell to his knees, his hands pressed to his temples, trying to block out the words, the thoughts, the voice. But it was inside him, twisting his insides, making him question everything. His life, his choices, his relationships, all of it felt like a lie. He had been lying to himself, hiding from the things he was most afraid of. And now they were all laid bare in front of him, like a mirror showing him every flaw, every weakness, every mistake. He wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to do anything to make it stop. But he couldn't. The voice was unrelenting. You're not strong enough to face the truth, Mark. You're not strong enough to face yourself. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. He had always prided himself on being strong, on being someone who could handle anything that life threw at him. But the truth was, he had been running from himself for years, hiding behind walls, behind masks, behind lies. And now, everything was crashing down. All of it. Mark's body shook violently as he crawled across the floor, his hands searching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. There was only the voice. His voice, echoing through the room, through his mind. You can't hide anymore, Mark. You've never been able to. You've always known the truth. And now it's all coming for you. The walls closed in tighter, the air thick with dread. Mark felt like he was being swallowed whole by the room, by the darkness that had always lived inside him. His vision blurred, his head spun. He could feel himself slipping away, losing himself in the echo of his own fears. There's no going back, the voice whispered, its tone almost sweet now, as if it were soothing him. You're mine, Mark. You always have been. Mark gasped, his breath coming in short, desperate bursts. He tried to push himself up again, but his body felt heavy, his limbs too weak to move. The figure from before had returned, not as a physical presence, but as a shadow that stretched across the room, swallowing him whole. I am you, Mark. You've known me all your life. I am the part of you that you can't escape. His heart raced, each beat a painful reminder of how trapped he was. How utterly powerless he felt in the face of his own mind. The voice, the figure, it was all a part of him. He couldn't run from himself. He wanted to scream. He wanted to fight. But all he could do was sit there, paralyzed, as the darkness continued to grow around him. "You've always known the truth," the voice repeated, its words a final echo in the void. "You've never been able to escape it, and now you never will." The room, the darkness, the voice, it all closed in on him, and for the first time Mark understood. He had never been running from something external. He had always been running from himself. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. Mark's world had become a maze of shadows. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now twisted and writhed like living creatures, suffocating him with their oppressive weight. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His thoughts were tangled, his mind a fractured mirror reflecting 1,000 broken pieces of himself. The voice, his voice, had stopped echoing for a moment, but the silence was even worse than the sound. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. He could feel it. It was inside him now, deeper than before. It had burrowed its way into the core of his being, and no matter how much he wanted to push it away, it refused to leave. His body felt numb, disconnected from his mind. Every movement was sluggish, as though the weight of his own guilt and fear was pulling him down, holding him in place. His hands trembled as they brushed against the floor, his fingertips brushing over the cold surface. It was as if the very room had become alien to him, a place where nothing was real, nothing was safe. He couldn't escape it. There was no door, no window, no way out. The voice came again, quieter this time, almost like a whisper against the back of his neck. "You can't run, Mark. You never could. You think you can outrun your own thoughts, your own fear?" Mark shuddered, his breath shallow and uneven. He could feel the voice sinking deeper, burrowing into the recesses of his mind, wrapping around every dark corner like a cold, unyielding hand. "You think you're in control, but you're not." The words were soft, almost soothing in their cruelty. "You've always been in control of nothing, Mark. You've always been afraid of what you might become. But look at you now. You've become exactly what you feared." The truth stung, sharper than anything he had ever felt before. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to keep everything together. But now, here in this empty room, with his thoughts spiraling out of control, he couldn't deny it. He had never been in control. He had always been afraid of what would happen if he let go. His heart raced, his chest constricting with each breath. He tried to stand up, to move, to do anything to shake off the suffocating weight of his own fear. But his legs buckled beneath him. He fell, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. The voice was laughing now, a low, mocking sound that reverberated through the room. "You thought you could escape it, didn't you?" "No," Mark shouted, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. He tried to push himself up again, but his hands slipped against the floor. His vision swam in and out of focus, his head spinning with the constant barrage of thoughts, memories, fears. It felt like he was drowning in them, unable to breathe, unable to think. The voice was everywhere, echoing in every corner of his mind. "You wanted to know the truth, Mark. You wanted to know who you really are. Well, now you do." The voice was closer now, almost right next to him, as though it was breathing in his ear. "You are weak. You are afraid. You are nothing but a coward." Mark shook his head, trying to push the words away. "I'm not a coward," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He had spent his whole life hiding from the truth, hiding from himself, from the things he was most afraid of. He had convinced himself that he was strong, that he could handle anything. But now, in the face of his own fear, he felt small, powerless, helpless. "You can't change, Mark. You've never been able to. You've always been afraid to change, afraid to face what's inside of you." The voice was insistent now, unyielding. It seemed to fill the entire room, wrapping itself around him like a shroud. Mark's body trembled as the weight of the words pressed down on him. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block it out, but the voice was inescapable. It was a part of him now, just like the darkness that had always lived inside him, the fear he had always run from. It's too late for you, Mark. You can't outrun yourself. You never could. He felt the room begin to spin again. His stomach twisted, nausea rising in his throat. He had to escape, he had to get away. But no matter where he looked, no matter how hard he tried, the darkness followed. It was everywhere. In desperation, he clawed at the floor, trying to crawl toward the door, but it felt so far away, like it was just out of reach. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, and each breath was a struggle. He couldn't think, couldn't move. His body felt like it was made of stone, heavy and unmoving. There's no escape, Mark. The voice was now mocking, cruel in its certainty. You've always been trapped in this cycle, always running from the truth, always afraid of what's inside you. And now it's too late. You can't hide anymore. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows pressing against his chest, suffocating him. His vision blurred, the world spinning faster and faster, and his voice, became a roar in his mind. His hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into his palms. He tried to scream, to push the voice away, but it was like it was a part of him. He could feel it inside his head, inside his soul, eating away at him, breaking him down piece by piece. You've always been afraid of who you are, Mark. The voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. But it's time to accept it. You've always known the truth. You've always known that this was coming. Mark's mind was shattering, every thought a jagged piece of glass cutting into his consciousness. The figure, the voice, it was all part of him, and he couldn't escape it. It was him. He had always been running from himself, hiding from the darkness inside him, and now it had caught up with him. As the darkness closed in, Mark finally understood. There was no way out. No escape. Not now. Not ever. Mark's mind felt like it was being torn apart, each thought fraying and unraveling in front of him. His body was rigid, trembling in place, but it felt as though he was no longer in control. He was being pulled under, dragged deeper into the abyss that had always lived inside him. The voice, his voice, continued to swirl around him, a constant hum, a presence that had no shape, but that filled every corner of his mind. It was like the air had turned to liquid, thick and suffocating, and the room, once so familiar, now seemed vast and infinite, stretching beyond the confines of the walls. Everything was closing in on him, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You've always known this moment would come, the voice whispered, softer now, but no less insistent. This moment when you would finally have to face what's inside you, the truth you've been avoiding. Mark pressed his hands against his ears, trying to drown out the voice, but it was inside him, crawling through his thoughts, his very skin. It was too late. There was no escape. The truth, like a dark shadow, was creeping through the cracks, and it was pulling him into the depths. He squeezed his eyes shut, his body shaking violently. "Please stop," he whispered, but the voice only grew louder. "You don't want to hear the truth, do you?" Mark's chest tightened as the voice pressed on, digging deeper, exposing every hidden fear, every lie he had told himself. He had never wanted to face it. The things he had done, the thoughts he had pushed away, the anger and hatred that had always simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to escape. He had built his life on a foundation of lies, telling himself that he was good, that he was strong. But the truth was he wasn't. He was weak. He had always been weak, hiding behind a mask of control. He gasped, his breath coming in short bursts, his pulse pounding in his ears. The world around him felt like it was twisting, the walls warping, stretching in unnatural ways. The shadows moved, flickering and curling like smoke, as though they were alive, feeding off his fear. He could feel them in the air, brushing against his skin, like the fingers of something unseen, something ancient. "You've always been afraid, Mark," the voice cooed, a dark satisfaction in its tone. "Afraid of what you might become. Afraid of what you might do." His head spun, and his body trembled with the force of it. He couldn't breathe. The darkness was swallowing him whole, and he was powerless to stop it. The more he struggled, the tighter it seemed to grip him. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were echoes of the past, fragments of things he had forgotten, or perhaps things he had never wanted to remember. "You were never in control," the voice said softly, almost lovingly. "You've always been at the mercy of your own desires. And now, you'll have to face them." Mark's vision blurred, and for a moment he saw flashes, fragments of memories, dark and twisted. Faces from his past, people he had wronged, moments when he had felt a flicker of rage, of jealousy, of something darker. His hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as though he could somehow rid himself of the pain. But the memories kept coming, each one sharper, more vivid, until they began to bleed into one another. His childhood, his teenage years, his adult life, every moment a reflection of the darkness that had always followed him. The fear, the loneliness, the violence, all of it was part of him. He couldn't escape it. It was inside him, and it always had been. "You've always been a coward, Mark," the voice said, almost tenderly now. "You can't escape your own darkness. You've always been too afraid to face it." Tears welled up in his eyes as the weight of it all crashed down on him. The guilt, the shame, the self-loathing, it was all consuming. His throat tightened as he struggled to swallow, to speak, to say anything, but the words wouldn't come. He was drowning in his own fears, in the echoes of his past. "You are nothing," the voice whispered. "Nothing but the sum of your mistakes, your fears. You'll never be free. You've always known that, deep down." Mark's body convulsed, his muscles seizing as the darkness tightened its grip. His head spun, and the room began to sway, as if the walls were breathing. He felt as though he was losing himself, as if his very identity was slipping away, replaced by something else, something darker. He was on the edge of breaking, his mind teetering between reality and madness, and he could feel himself falling into the abyss. The voice was there, pulling him down, dragging him deeper into the shadows. "You will never escape," the voice said, its tone final, cold. "This is who you are, Mark. This is what you've always been." Mark's breath hitched in his throat as the last remnants of his will to fight slipped away. His body went limp, his mind shrouded in darkness. The room was silent now, but the silence was worse than any noise. It was the silence of defeat, of surrender. And then, as if to seal his fate, the voice came once more, its whisper the last thing he would ever hear. "You were never meant to be free, Mark. This is your prison. This is your destiny." Mark's body lay still, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, but his mind was far from calm. It was like being caught between two worlds, the one that he could touch, feel, and sense, and another one, darker and more twisted, where his thoughts were not his own. The voice, the echo, had receded for a moment, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to return. The silence, once a relief, now felt heavy, oppressive. Every inch of air around him seemed thick with tension, as though something were watching him, waiting for him to slip, to break. He blinked his eyes open, his vision blurry at first, but soon focusing on the dim light filtering through the window. It was late, almost midnight, if the clock on the wall was right. The shadows were long, creeping over the walls like the fingers of something ancient. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt like lead, too heavy to lift. His mind was foggy, disjointed, and his throat burned with the aftertaste of panic. The echoes had quieted, but he couldn't rid himself of their presence. His own voice, the voice of his worst fears, his darkest secrets, had taken root in his head. It was a part of him now, a constant reminder that the walls of his mind had cracked open, letting in the darkness. Mark forced himself to sit up, each movement slow and labored, like he was underwater. His surroundings felt unfamiliar, like a dream he couldn't wake up from. The room looked the same as it always had, yet everything felt wrong. The air was too thick, too stagnant. He could hear the faintest hum, like a distant whisper, and for a moment, he thought it was the voice returning. But no, it wasn't. It was something else. He turned his head, searching the room. His eyes locked on the mirror hanging above the dresser. His reflection was distorted, like a shadow of himself. The face staring back at him wasn't the same one he remembered. There was something different, something wrong. The eyes in the reflection were darker, colder, filled with a depth of despair Mark couldn't comprehend. Mark. The whisper was faint, almost like a breath against his ear. He whipped around, his heart pounding, but the room was empty. There was no one there, just the darkness, thick and oppressive. But then he heard it again, his name, spoken with a mocking tenderness. His pulse quickened, a jolt of fear surging through him. Mark. The voice was faint, but it was his voice. It wasn't coming from the mirror, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside him. "Who's there?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from the fear that had gripped him. The words felt hollow, as though they were falling into a void that would never release them. No response, just the silence, thickening around him like a fog. He rose shakily to his feet, his legs wobbling beneath him. His body felt alien, his own movements seeming out of place, like he wasn't in full control. The room, too, seemed to twist and stretch before his eyes, the shadows bending in unnatural ways. It was as if the very fabric of reality was warping, reshaping itself. His hands reached for the mirror, almost instinctively. His reflection seemed to beckon him, drawing him in. He had to look closer. Maybe, just maybe, if he saw what was really there, he would find an answer, a way to stop the madness that was swallowing him whole. But as his fingers grazed the surface of the glass, his reflection shifted. The face staring back at him contorted, its mouth twisting into a grotesque, unnatural smile. The eyes, once cold and distant, now seemed to glimmer with something darker, something hungry. "You still think you can fight it?" the reflection whispered, its voice mocking, like the echo in his mind. "You've already lost. There's no escaping who you really are." Mark jerked his hand back, his heart slamming against his chest. His breath caught in his throat. The reflection was wrong, twisted, nothing like what he saw when he looked at himself in the mirror each morning. He staggered back, his legs weak beneath him. "You can't outrun it," the voice inside him said again, louder now, more insistent. "You are nothing but a reflection of your darkest self, a prisoner to your own mind." Mark's knees gave out, and he fell to the floor with a dull thud. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening, but it was no use. The lines between reality and delusion had blurred, and he could no longer tell which was which. Every thought felt like it was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, and he had to fight to keep from suffocating. "You always knew this would happen," the voice continued. "You couldn't hide forever. You can't keep pretending you're someone you're not." Mark clawed at his head, his fingers pressing into his temples, trying to push the voice out, trying to stop it from taking over. But it wouldn't stop. It was inside him, a part of him that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He gasped for air, his breath coming in short, desperate bursts. His vision blurred, and he swore he saw shadows shifting at the edges of the room. Shapes, figures, dark silhouettes that moved with an eerie grace just beyond his sight. He wasn't alone. He wasn't alone at all. The room seemed to stretch and warp, and for a moment, Mark saw something, someone, standing in the doorway. A figure tall and looming, its face obscured by the darkness. Mark's heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. He couldn't move. His limbs were frozen, as though the very sight of the figure had paralyzed him. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving Mark alone again. "You're not alone," the voice said, and Mark felt the air grow colder. Not anymore. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat, the shadows shifting, closing in on him, as though they were alive, aware of his every move. The darkness had him now. It was everywhere, inescapable, and it was waiting for him to break. Mark closed his eyes, trying to block out the suffocating pressure, but all he could hear was the voice, echoing over and over, filling his mind with its cruel whispers. His breath came in ragged gasps as his chest tightened with panic. "You can never escape," the voice purred, its tone so smooth, so familiar. "The darkness is inside you, Mark. It always has been." Mark's thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm, and the darkness that surrounded him seemed to feed on the chaos in his mind. Each whisper, each echo, was a thread pulling him further away from himself, from the reality he once knew. The weight of it all, the room, the shadows, the voice, pressed down on him like an invisible hand, suffocating, crushing, and relentless. He tried to stand, but his legs were weak, his body trembling as if every muscle was being stretched to its breaking point. The echoes in his mind grew louder, until they felt like they were vibrating in his bones. Each whisper, each murmur, twisted and warped in a way that made his stomach churn. "You can't run from it," the voice whispered, but this time, it wasn't coming from inside his head. It was outside, echoing from somewhere in the room, right behind him. Mark spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but the room was empty. His breath came in ragged bursts, his pulse thumping in his ears. Sweat dripped down his forehead as his eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, only the silence, thick and suffocating. Then another whisper, closer this time, right by his ear. "You can't escape yourself." Mark gasped and spun, his body crashing into the dresser. He stumbled back, his feet tripping over something soft, and he tumbled to the floor. His heart raced, panic gripping him like a vice. The shadows seemed to press him tighter, closing around him until he couldn't see anything but the void, stretching endlessly in every direction. "It's too late," the voice said, a low murmur that echoed in the very core of his being. "You've already crossed the line. There's no turning back." Mark's chest tightened as the air grew colder. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the shadows seemed to shift, forming shapes that didn't belong. His vision blurred again, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw faces, half-formed, distorted faces, staring back at him from the darkness. Eyes filled with silent judgment, eyes that knew everything about him, everything he had hidden, everything he had buried deep inside. "They know," the voice purred. "They know what you've done, what you're capable of." Mark clutched his head, his fingers digging into his scalp, trying to force the whispers out, but they wouldn't stop. They were everywhere, inside his mind, inside his body, inside his soul. The darkness was consuming him, erasing him piece by piece. "What did you think would happen, Mark?" The voice was no longer soft, no longer gentle. It was mocking, cold, relentless. "You can't hide from yourself. Not forever." His breath quickened, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven gasps. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape this nightmare, but his body was frozen, trapped in place by the weight of his own fears. His hands shook as he reached out, gripping the floor beneath him, but the shadows kept closing in, surrounding him on all sides. The room was no longer just a room. It had become something else, something alive. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting, breathing, like the heart of some ancient, malevolent creature. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the very atmosphere were pressing down on him, crushing him. "You've always known," the voice continued, each word like a needle, digging deeper into his psyche. "Deep down, you've always known what you are. What you've always been." Mark's eyes flicked to the mirror again, drawn to it against his will. The reflection in the glass had changed once more. The face staring back at him wasn't his own. It was a grotesque version, twisted and distorted. His features were warped, as if the very act of looking at himself had changed him, had torn him apart. "Look at what you've become," the voice taunted. "You can't even recognize yourself anymore. And neither can they." Mark staggered back, his feet unsteady, and he collided with the wall. The darkness around him seemed to thicken, as if it were alive, feeding off his fear. The whispers were becoming louder now, more insistent, until they were no longer whispers at all, but a cacophony, an overwhelming surge of voices all screaming at him at once. "You've been running from the truth," the voice sneered, its tone cruel, unforgiving. "Running from yourself. But there's nowhere left to hide." Mark's hands trembled as he pressed them to his ears, trying to block out the onslaught of sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside him now, filling him, consuming him from the inside out. His thoughts felt fragmented, like shattered glass, and he couldn't hold on to anything anymore. "You've always known," the voice whispered again, this time almost lovingly. "This is who you are, Mark. You're nothing but a monster." He felt his knees buckle, his body giving out beneath him. His mind was a whirlwind, spinning out of control. He wanted to scream, to beg for it to stop, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was fall to the floor, his face pressed into the cold wood, the darkness suffocating him, drowning him. In the distance, he heard something, a faint sound, almost like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the silence. But when he looked up, there was no one there. The room was empty again, save for the shadows that seemed to stretch farther, growing taller, looming over him. "It's too late to save yourself," the voice said, almost pitying. "You're already gone." Mark's body trembled as he tried to push himself up, but his strength was failing him. His mind was a blur, his thoughts slipping away like water through his fingers. He wanted to fight, to run, but it felt like the world was collapsing around him, crushing him under the weight of his own mind. The voice had become a constant hum, a steady presence in his mind. It was no longer just a voice. It was a part of him, a reflection of everything he had tried to ignore, everything he had tried to bury. He couldn't escape it. There was no escape. "You are who you've always been," the voice whispered, its tone final. "And there is no escape from yourself." The darkness was complete now. The room was gone, the walls, the floor, everything had disappeared. Mark was no longer in his body, no longer in the room. He was floating in a void, weightless, lost in the dark expanse that seemed to stretch forever. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't escape. And in that infinite darkness, the voice remained. It was him. It had always been him. Mark floated in the emptiness, unable to tell where his body ended and the darkness began. The silence was deafening, but the weight of the voice, the echo of his own mind, was more crushing than any sound. It clung to him like a shadow just out of reach, but always present, like a parasite feeding on his fear, his guilt, his every thought. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, but this time, it didn't come from the outside. It was inside him, inside his very soul, as if it were the essence of who he was, what he had always been. "There is no running. Not from yourself." The emptiness around him seemed to stretch and grow, folding in on itself in an endless loop. Mark felt like he was being drawn into the void, his body disintegrating with every passing second, every thought. His breath hitched, but there was no air, nothing to fill his lungs, nothing to ground him. Just the sensation of falling deeper into the blackness, the weight of the echo pressing in on him from all sides. "You were always alone," the voice continued, this time with a bitter edge, as though it were savoring the revelation. "Even when you thought you were surrounded by people, you were alone. Always." Mark's mind raced, scrambling for any sense of reality, any connection to the world he once knew. But it was like trying to hold onto a dream, slipping through his fingers the moment he tried to grasp it. "You never really knew them," the voice purred, slithering through his thoughts like a serpent. "Not like you know yourself. And the truth is, Mark, you don't even know who you are anymore." His heart thundered in his chest, and his hands, now invisible in the darkness, clutched at the empty space around him, as if he could somehow pull himself back to solid ground. But there was no ground. There was no up or down, no light or dark, only the endless void and the voice, growing louder, more insistent, more omnipresent. "Look at what you've become," the voice hissed. "Look at the things you've hidden, the things you've done. Mark's mind flickered with flashes of memories, snippets of his life, his choices, his actions. Some were innocuous, but others darker. He saw faces, too, people he had wronged, people he had hurt, and even people he had forgotten. The guilt surged within him like a tidal wave, drowning him. He had spent so long pretending to be someone he wasn't, wearing masks to hide the truth. But the truth had always been inside him, waiting to come to light. "You can't outrun it," the voice taunted. "You can't outrun what's inside you." "Well, you really are." Suddenly, he felt a jolt, an unnatural shift. The void seemed to collapse inward, pulling at him. For the briefest moment, he thought he could see something real, just ahead of him. A flicker of light, maybe. He strained toward it, desperate for anything that felt solid, that felt like an anchor. "You want to escape," the voice mocked, the coldness wrapping around each word like a curse. "But you can't. You've made your bed, Mark. Now lie in it." Mark's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to deny it, to fight back. He was not this thing, this shadow that the voice painted him to be. But the harder he tried to resist, the more the darkness seemed to claim him, filling every space with whispers of doubt, of guilt, of all the things he had pushed aside for so long. And then there was again the voice of someone he recognized. Not the echo, not the darkness, but a real voice, a person, his wife, Sarah. He heard her faintly, as if she were speaking from far away. "Mark?" Her voice was soft, fragile, but full of concern. It sliced through the fog of his mind like a lifeline, pulling him towards something real, something human. "Mark, where are you?" The sound of her voice broke through the grip of the darkness. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt something other than the crushing weight of the void. He could almost picture her face, her worried expression, the warmth in her eyes. He wanted to reach out, to call back to her, to tell her he was okay. But the voice inside him, his own voice, twisted and mocking, stopped him. "She doesn't understand," it sneered. "No one does. Not really. They can't know you like I do." Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was true. No one understood. No one could understand the darkness that lived inside him. Not even Sarah. The guilt gnawed at him again, the truth he had always buried deep inside clawing its way to the surface. But then the light, the flicker he had seen earlier, grew brighter. It wasn't just a glimmer now. It was a presence, something solid, something tangible, reaching toward him. He felt a pull, an instinctive urge to follow it. He wanted to reach it. He needed to. "You can't escape," the voice whispered one last time, its tone a sickeningly sweet lullaby. "This is who you are, Mark. There's no running from it. You're mine." With all the strength he could muster, Mark fought back. He focused on the light, pushing against the suffocating grip of the darkness. The voice faded, distant now, weaker, as the light grew stronger, more real, more alive. "Mark!" Sarah's voice echoed again, this time clearer, closer. "Come back to me." And then, just as the darkness was about to consume him completely, Mark reached out. He reached for the light, for Sarah, for the one thing that felt real in a world of twisted illusions. Mark's hand stretched forward, his fingers tingling with the anticipation of something real, something that could pull him out of the suffocating abyss. The void seemed to shudder, as though resisting his movement, but the light was there, stronger now, growing with every inch he gained. He pushed against the weight of the darkness with everything he had. The cold, creeping tendrils that had been clinging to him, trying to drag him back into the abyss, now recoiled slightly, as if uncertain. He could still hear the voice, his own voice, whispering in the far reaches of his mind, but it was becoming a distant murmur, fading with each step he took toward the light. "You can't leave me," the voice said, now barely audible, desperate, almost pleading. "You can't escape. I'm you, Mark. I always have been." The words echoed, but Mark refused to listen. He was almost there. He could feel the warmth of the light now, wrapping around him like a soft embrace. It wasn't just a beacon in the dark, it was hope. It was Sarah. He could almost hear her breathing, could almost feel the safety of her presence. "Come back," she called, and this time it wasn't just her voice. It was her touch, her hand, her warmth, reaching out to him. "Mark, please come back to me." And then he was through. The darkness dissolved in an instant, like smoke fading into the night. The weight on his chest lifted, the pressure around his mind eased. His breath came in shuddering gasps, the air suddenly rich and full, like the world was alive again. The oppressive silence was replaced by the soft hum of life, the sounds of the outside world filtering back into his consciousness. Mark blinked, disoriented, his heart racing as his surroundings came into focus. He was no longer floating in that endless void. He was in a room, a familiar room, the room he had been in before, all along. The light from a lamp on the bedside table spilled across the floor, casting long, soft shadows on the walls. And there she was, Sarah. She was sitting beside him on the bed, her hand on his, her face filled with concern. Her eyes were wide, searching, but there was a gentleness in them that Mark had not seen in a long time. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" He nodded slowly, his throat tight as he tried to find the words. He wanted to speak, to reassure her, to explain everything he had just experienced, but the weight of it all was still there, heavy, pressing, suffocating. He swallowed hard and squeezed her hand. I don't know," he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. I think I was lost." Sarah's brow furrowed, and she leaned closer, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Lost? What do you mean? You've been out of it for days, Mark." I didn't know what to do. You wouldn't wake up. You wouldn't speak, asterisk." His mind spun. Days? He had been here for days, trapped in that nightmare. The world outside felt so real now, yet the remnants of the void still clung to him like a shadow. The voice, the darkness, the whispers, they weren't gone. They lingered, just beneath the surface, waiting to return. "What happened to me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She sighed, her eyes full of worry. "I don't know. You came back from the trip, and then you started acting strange. You wouldn't talk about it, just said you were tired, but I could see it. Something happened, Mark. Something changed." Mark shook his head slowly, trying to process her words, but the images from his time in the void, the sound of the whispers, were still there. They haunted him, gnawed at him like a hunger he couldn't satisfy. He had been on the brink of something terrible, and it felt like it was still waiting for him, lurking in the background, ready to strike again. He closed his eyes, trying to shake off the dizziness that clung to him like a fog. The room seemed solid enough, but his mind was far from clear. He had escaped the darkness, sure, but had it truly let him go? Or was this just another layer, another echo of the nightmare that had been consuming him? Sarah's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Mark, you're not alone," she said gently, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together. I'm here. You're not lost anymore. We'll figure it out. We'll find a way to fix this." Mark opened his eyes and met her gaze. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that he was safe, that he could escape whatever had been tormenting him. But the gnawing fear in the pit of his stomach told him that the nightmare was far from over. He nodded weakly, his throat dry. "I hope so," he muttered. "But I don't know if I can trust myself anymore. Something isn't right." Sarah looked at him with concern, her fingers still tracing circles on his hand. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated, his eyes flicking to the window, to the dark sky beyond. He could feel the weight of it all again, like a presence just outside the window watching him. His pulse quickened, and he pulled his hand away from hers, staring at the floor. "I hear it," he whispered. "The voice. The whispers. It's still there. I thought I was free, but I don't know. Maybe it's all in my head, but it feels real. Too real." The room fell into silence as Sarah processed his words. For a moment, it felt as though everything hung in the air, suspended between them. Mark could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. and the air around him seemed to grow heavy again, like something was watching, waiting. "Mark," Sarah said softly, after what felt like an eternity, "whatever this is, we'll face it together. We'll figure it out. But you have to trust me. You have to trust us." He looked up at her, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by a determination, a hope that he wasn't sure he could hold on to. He wanted to believe her. He needed to. But deep down, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was still there. It had only just begun. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts, as Mark tried to steady his breathing. He wanted to hold on to Sarah's reassurance, to trust that she was right, that this nightmare would fade away, that it was all just a trick of his mind. But the echoes, the whispers, the things he'd heard in the dark, they were still with him, lingering like a shadow, even in the warmth of the room. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm, "I need you to listen to me. I know you're scared, and I know it feels real, but you have to trust that it's not. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. You've been under a lot of stress lately, and I think this is all just overwhelming. But we'll get through it. We'll figure it out together." Mark nodded, though a part of him still wanted to pull away. The voice inside him, the one that had been speaking from the dark void, had whispered something that sent a chill down his spine. "You think you're free, but you're not." It was always there, just beneath the surface of his thoughts, crawling like a worm through the cracks in his mind. And as Sarah spoke, he could almost hear it again, soft, like a breath against his ear. "You're not free, Mark," it murmured. "Not really. You can't escape it. Not from me. Not from yourself." Mark's hand shot out to the side of the bed, gripping the edge tightly, as though he could hold himself together. The whispering seemed louder now, as though it were closer, just behind him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowing in concern. "Mark? Are you okay?" Her voice broke off as she saw the look in his eyes, the panic beginning to seep in. "What's wrong?" He didn't know how to answer. How could he explain that he was hearing things no one else could hear? How could he tell her that the voice, that horrible, mocking voice, wasn't just in his head? It was everywhere. It was him. I'm not." He swallowed hard, trying to find the words. "I can't shake it, Sarah. It's here. I don't know where it's coming from, but it's real. I feel it. It's in my head, in my mind, like it's always been a part of me." Sarah's hand gently cupped his face, pulling his attention back to her. "Mark, listen to me. I know this feels terrifying, but you're not alone. You're with me. We'll get you through this. Okay, we'll get you help if we need to. But I need you to trust me, to trust us." But deep down, Mark knew. The voice had always been there, even before this. It was him, and he was it. He had tried to ignore it for years, pushed it down with distractions, with the mundane routine of his life. But now it had surfaced, dragged to the forefront of his mind by whatever force had been unleashed in the darkness. The room felt colder now, despite the warmth of the lamp beside him. A strange chill crept across his skin, and the edges of the shadows on the wall seemed to twist and stretch, as though they were alive. The soft hum of the room, the distant sounds of the city outside, all seemed muffled, as though a curtain had fallen between him and the rest of the world. "You're not alone," the voice echoed again, louder this time, filling every corner of his mind. "You never were." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, and he stood up quickly, ignoring the dizziness that spun through his head. He had to get out of this room, out of this place, away from the whispers. He needed to breathe, to think. The walls were closing in. The pressure was unbearable. "Mark!" Sarah cried, reaching out to him as he stumbled toward the door. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer her. He couldn't. The voice was getting louder, and he could hear his own words reflected back at him. "You can't run from me, Mark." His fingers shook as he fumbled for the doorknob, finally twisting it open and stepping out into the dim hallway. The house felt different now. The floorboards creaked under his feet in a way they hadn't before, the air heavy with something oppressive, as though the walls themselves were watching him. He rushed down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence, but the echo was wrong. It wasn't just the sound of his feet. It was something else. His own voice, twisted, distorted, was following him, reverberating off the walls, filling the space. "You can't outrun yourself," it taunted. Mark turned sharply, his mind racing as he tried to escape the suffocating sensation that clung to him. The hallway stretched out before him, an endless, narrow corridor of shadows, but as he moved, the walls seemed to shift, to bend and warp, pulling him back, closer to the source of the voice. He could feel the darkness closing in again, creeping up from behind, waiting for him to slip. Every corner he turned felt like it led him in circles, each step taking him further into the web of his own mind, his own fears. He could almost see himself reflected in the walls now, a twisted, distorted version of himself, standing just out of reach. "You'll never escape," the voice whispered, so close now, it felt like it was inside his very soul. He stopped dead in his tracks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was no longer alone in the hallway. He could feel it, them, a presence, a shadow looming just behind him. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with the sound of his own heartbeat. And then there was a sound, a soft, barely audible whisper. "Mark," it said, this time not from his own mind. "Mark, turn around." He froze, fear clawing at his chest as he slowly turned, his eyes darting around the dark hallway. But there was nothing there, only the shadows, stretching longer and darker in the dim light. Yet he felt it, them, just beyond the corner, just out of sight. "Turn around," the voice repeated, its tone like a command. Mark's pulse quickened as he took a slow step back. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a presence. A thing. He could feel it pressing in on him, like a weight on his chest. But when he finally turned, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a shadow at the end of the hallway. It was a reflection. There, at the far end of the corridor, he saw himself standing, eyes wide, staring back at him. But this version of him wasn't the same. It was twisted, its face contorted in a grotesque expression. The eyes, dark and hollow, stared right through him, and the corners of its mouth curled into a sinister grin. Mark took a step back, his body trembling. "No," he whispered. "This isn't real. It can't be. This isn't me." But the reflection, the thing that wore his face, tilted its head just slightly and smiled wider. "Oh, but it is," it whispered. "You can't escape what you are. Not from me. Not from yourself." Mark's chest tightened, his breath shallow as the reflection of himself grinned back at him, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim hallway. His heart raced, and his body tensed, wanting to run, but something kept him rooted in place, as if the weight of the moment had sunk deep into his bones. He could feel the dark presence drawing closer, his own twisted doppelganger moving toward him in slow, deliberate steps. He reached for the wall to steady himself, his hand brushing against the cold, damp surface. The voice echoed in his mind, louder now, filling every crevice of his thoughts, drowning out everything else. "You can't escape me, Mark. You never have. You're already trapped." The reflection, no, the thing that looked like him, took another step forward. Mark could see the twisted smile spread wider, like it was savoring his fear. Its voice came again, deeper, more menacing this time. "You've been listening to me all along. You've been running from yourself, hiding from the truth. You can't outrun what's inside." Mark's knees felt weak. His hands trembled at his sides, but he couldn't look away from the creature, his own face staring back at him. It was wrong, so wrong, but it was him. And as much as he wanted to deny it, part of him knew the truth. He was trapped. Not just in the house, not just in the hallway. He was trapped inside his own mind, in the darkest recesses of himself, a place where the lines between him and the monster he feared were blurred beyond recognition. The creature that wore his face cocked its head, mirroring Mark's every movement. You think you can fix this? That you can escape me, it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. You can't even fix yourself. You can't outrun the dark corners of your mind. You never could. Mark recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but his legs felt heavy, like the weight of the dark force was pulling him down. It wasn't just the creature in front of him. It was the darkness inside him, the parts of him he had buried, the things he had ignored for years. It was all coming to the surface now, and he had nowhere to hide. You were always mine, the reflection sneered, its voice a mocking whisper. You can never escape what you are. Mark stumbled backward, his body shaking, and suddenly, the hallway seemed to stretch longer, the walls closing in around him. The light from the lamp flickered, casting erratic shadows across the floor. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, drowning out his thoughts. But then something in him snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't let this thing, this part of himself, consume him. Not now. Not like this. With a raw, desperate cry, Mark pushed forward, his legs moving on instinct. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to get away. He had to break free from the thing that had been chasing him, from the darkness that had been clawing at him for so long. He ran down the hallway, not looking back, not caring what he left behind. The whispers grew frantic, echoing in his mind, trying to pull him back, to drag him into the void. But Mark kept running, pushing forward, his breath ragged, his body desperate to escape. Then, as he reached the end of the hall, the air around him shifted. The walls seemed to bend, the shadows stretching toward him like hands, and the room distorted. He didn't stop, though. He kept moving, his feet pounding against the floor, the fear in his chest growing heavier with every step. And then he hit something. A wall. No, a door. He fumbled for the handle, his hands slick with sweat, his breath coming in panicked gasps. The whispers were almost deafening now, the voice of the creature, his own voice, echoing louder and louder, until it felt like it was tearing him apart. You can't leave me, it hissed, the sound coming from all directions. You're mine. Mark's fingers finally found the door handle, and he yanked it open, stepping into a space that was different. It wasn't the hallway anymore. It wasn't even the house. It was a different place entirely. It was a room of pure white light, a vast emptiness stretching out in every direction. He blinked, disoriented, feeling the weight of everything in his chest. The voice was still there, but it was distant now. The whispers faded into a low hum, barely a murmur at the edge of his thoughts. In this white space, there were no shadows, no walls closing in. It was just space, boundless, empty, and silent. And then, standing before him, he saw her. Sarah. She was standing in the middle of the room, her face soft with concern, but there was no fear in her eyes. She was calm, steady. Mark, she said softly, her voice the only sound in the vast emptiness. You're not alone anymore. You've never been alone. He stared at her, his heart still racing, but the fear seemed to ebb away, replaced by something else, a sense of peace, of release. The room, the whispers, the reflection, all of it faded as Sarah took a step toward him, her arms open. You fought for so long, she continued, but now you can let go. It's time. Mark didn't know how long he stood there, his body trembling, but he felt the weight of years of pain, fear, and darkness slowly lift off of him. For the first time in so long, he could breathe without the suffocating weight of his own mind pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he reached for her, as if by doing so he could finally anchor himself. The voice, his own voice, was gone, leaving only the hum of quiet peace in its wake. It's over, Sarah whispered, her hands gentle on his shoulders. It's finally over. Mark closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her touch, the comfort of her presence. The world outside, the darkness, the voice, it didn't matter anymore. He had finally broken free. As the light around them flickered, the last remnants of the echoes faded. He could hear only silence now, and for the first time in years, it was enough. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.